Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another conversation in practical theology with me, Saiyyidah Zaidi and Eric Stoddart. Today, we're going to be looking and discussing spirituality and religion. How do they relate to each other? Are they the same thing? Can you be religious without spirituality? Can you experience spirituality without religion? I know that there's going to be a lot to cover within this conversation, so we'll try and kind of discuss as many topics as we can, and we can always come back to it another time. So let me kind of kick off by asking, Eric, do you think spirituality and religion are the same thing?
No, I think there's quite a difference between religion and spirituality. And I take it really that religion is attached to institutions and organizations. So we have Christian religion, we have Muslim religion, Hindu religion, and in some way or other, to a greater or lesser extent, there are institutions involved in that. Whereas spirituality is much, much more all-encompassing. So our approach to life, our sense of wonder, of the other, transcendence, however someone wants to practice that or think about that or engage in some way, there's no need for that spirituality to be attached to institutions and organizations. And it may be very new tradition or it may be old tradition. So I think you can be spiritual without being religious. And you could probably be religious without being spiritual, but let's come back to that.
It's interesting because for me, I wouldn't say that I am attached to a particular institution, as in a particular mosque. I mean, we've spoken before about how there's particular mosques that I like going to. And I think Muslims, we have a direct relationship with God, that we don't have to go through any kind of imam or scholar or anything like that. And so for me, the connection with religion and spirituality comes through my daily practice, which is the 5 prayers a day and the fasting and how I eat and all of those other kind of rituals that I do. So I suppose, because I was going to say, actually, my spirituality isn't connected to institutions, and it's not. But I think that it's probably connected to rituals and to the day-to-day practice of my faith. So for me, it's faith in action, and it's kind of a regular reminder of why I've chosen and selected this particular path. Because, you know, as adults, we can choose any path, right? But
yeah, but maybe I've too tightly defined institution, because I think as you're talking about ritual and fasting and tradition, those are to some extent institutionalized. They're coming from a social system, a broad cultural network, scriptures, all of those. And in that sense, there's an organizational element in some way to do with those formal rituals that have developed over time. So it's not just a building or a financial organization. When I say institution, I sort of mean that big social structure or systems.
yeah, I mean, I suppose it's for me, it's about having the rules. So for me, the rules come from the Quran and the Sunnah is the documented way in which the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, and his companions kind of lived their life. And so even yesterday, my mum and myself were having quite a heated debate about a couple of things. And I said, look, I know nothing about this. And until I learn more, I cannot comment on it. I'm not going to be drawn into a conversation where I don't have the knowledge. And it just made me realize that one of the things that we are taught is that, you know, you don't follow the faith of your fathers. And by that, it means that just because somebody else kind of does a particular ritual or follows a particular path or way, I'm not going to be able to stand up on Judgment Day in front of God and say, oh, I did that because my dad did it or because that other person did it. I've got to work it out for myself. And so as a result of that, I think you're right that there's ritualistic practice and there's things that have become ingrained because other people do it. But then I'm 100% confident in this. I'm not praying because anyone else has told me to. I'm not fasting because anyone else has told me to. I'm doing those acts because I believe that they are part of my daily worship to God, and that's how I should worship God. And if I didn't do those things, I think my relationship with God might be less. But is that spirituality or is that religion? I'm kind of like, but now I'm at a loss when I'm trying to really unpack it.
I would not want to imply anything automatically negative about religion. I think there's a lot we can criticize about religion and the way that we're using the term here. But the fact that you pray 5 times a day rather than 6 or 4 suggests that there is an institutional dimension to that it's not an arbitrary number.
It's a number that was given to God when he was kind of like, journeying up to, well, actually it was a direct instruction from God to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, and that's why it's 5. And I think when I look at it, without going into too much detail, the number used to be a lot greater, and then he was like, Moses advised God on his journey up to the heavens to ask for the number to be reduced, and that's why we've ended up with 5. So 5, when I say 5, it's kind of like 5 times I sit down on a prayer mat and I have a direct conversation with God. That doesn't mean that when I'm sitting making my cup of coffee or before we have this conversation, I won't kind of say, okay, God, you've got to help me out on this one, or ask for some guidance or some assistance. So, and could one go as, because I really believe that 24 hours a day can be in worship. And for me, how that happens is by following the prophetic tradition. So when I go to sleep, I will go to sleep. When I remember, of course, I'll go to sleep in the particular ways that the prophet advised us to. I will eat my food by saying a prayer. When I begin my work, I'll begin by saying a prayer and asking for assistance. Then all of those little acts then can make my entire day an act of worship. And I think by using those moments to reconnect with God, I think I am a more spiritual person, because I'm much more conscious of how am I connecting with my creator. If I just did them as a checklist, things that I have to tick off the box, I mean, anyone can do that, but it doesn't really improve your experience or your quality of life. And that for me is when then practical theology just is completely out the window, because it's more about the ritualistic practice without any of that experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's maybe a third category, with religion, ritualism, and spirituality. Because that ritualism, where someone is simply doing something as a checklist, I'm not even sure if that's an entirely bad thing. Because there's a luxury maybe in having the time and having the capacity and the interest to consider something in depth. But maybe the doing something just because that's what you do, if it's going to mass, if it's praying 5 times a day, if it's doing X, Y, or Z, the doing it because that's what one does, is that ritualistic? It might be just doing it because it's ritual, but it might be because that's all that someone's got to hang on to, and that the deeper questions about it are just too difficult and too painful maybe to explore. So what looks like ritualistic behavior could actually be profound worship.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, because I think we spend a lot of time trying to unpack who we are, and then looking at somebody else and making an assessment by them. But actually what we should really be doing is spending all of that time trying to work out who we are and not even considering what others are doing, because others, whilst they may not be ritualistic in their practice, they may not go to church or the mosque or the synagogue, whatever, but they may not even have a faith, but they could be better people than us.
And I'm thinking back to my own Christian past when I was in a very different type of Christian community, which valued the sort of thing we're talking about, being very intentional about what you do and being very methodical and having a disciplined form of spirituality that was also quite intense and had a lot of sort of emotion within it. And that tradition tended to look down on those other Christian traditions that did things out of repetition or repeated the same, crossing oneself, or having a more sort of fixed type of style of worship. And that was always assumed to be ritualistic. And I confess that that's how I used to think, 30 years ago. But then as I moved into a different type of Christianity that was what I would have before seen as very ritualistic, I struggled because initially I thought people are just doing this. But actually the difference was they weren't wearing their spirituality on their sleeve. That was the difference. They were using all these methods to differing extents, but they weren't projecting the spirituality in the way that I had been expected to do in my earlier form of Christianity. So I made a big shift to realize a lot of the criticisms I'd made of other Christians was completely misplaced, because theirs was, yes, it was more ritualistic than mine, but yet it was probably more meaningful and more authentic. But then in my more spontaneous sort of thing, it was actually ritualistic in its own way. So it's very difficult to just go on what we see, and maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, because I think, there's a difference between, for example, when I pray and praying just to get it done, and praying and really kind of like having what I call that conversation with God and connecting. And I mean, my standards are crazy high. So that moment of connection when I can really feel like I had that conversation and got some guidance, those things, they happen very few and far between. And I've tried everything, right? You name it, I've tried it in order to bring that on. And that kind of act of connection is, in Islam, is called something called khushu. And it means, and it's kind of like, it's got its own way of how you can develop it. Now, I suspect I'm not doing it properly, but I can try and do as much as I can to obtain that connection. And when you have the khushu in your prayer, then you get more reward. So there's like degrees of reward that you will get. But of course, the entry to the reward is actually doing the act itself. And I think for me, kind of like remembering that I've got to pray and making sure that I do it is, sometimes it is challenging because life can get in the way. And other times when I've adopted what one might call kind of modern day acts of spirituality, like meditation and mindfulness and things, then yes, of course, it does help me focus more. But I think that meditation and mindfulness and all of these other things, they've become kind of framed as modern day because all of a sudden these things are in the West. But actually, if we look over to the East, then clearly that's where they come from. And there have been methods of kind of meditation and retreating and just kind of spending time reflecting that have always been present within Islam, in the history of the Middle East, etc. So that I think they've been there within the Abrahamic tradition. I just think that they've got lost.
I think you're right, and certainly in Christianity, that sort of traditions of meditation and have come and gone over history. And the sort of development of the whole monastic tradition coming out from the desert in the early years of Christianity, desert worship, and then how that was developed later into monasticism. And then things, it's maybe too simple a story, but things become formalized, and then there are recoveries in different groups, like the Methodists in England in the 18th century, discovering a new vibrancy. And then just there seems to be that within Christianity, at least, the sort of little explosions every now and again of this sort of intensity and rediscovery, feeling that it's new, but actually building on ancient discoveries. Yeah,
and I think we're probably, like in the West, when we look at things like mindfulness and meditation, and I know that they are two completely different things. We look at these as a quick fix to help us to connect even more with God. And to me, it doesn't really matter what the tool is, as long as the connection and the experience is greater.
See, I think the quick fix thing is really key to what you've analysed, because that's a scientific, technological way of thinking, that here we can use this technique, we can use this tool in order to achieve a certain purpose. And that's great if it's engineering, but maybe not so great when it's about relationship with God, when it's about relationship with other people. But that maybe accounts for some of the sort of dissipation of spirituality in depth, where it's turned into simply a technique or a quick fix. But the older traditions, maybe they suffered from that a little bit, but I don't get that sense. They maybe appreciated the long haul.
And maybe that's why the concept of religion is seen as, if you identify as a religious person, you're seen as an anomaly, or you're seen as something strange, whereas once you start talking about spirituality, all of a sudden it just becomes much more accepted. And I think that's because now, as the pace of life is, and as we have the technology which has just taken over, etc., we have less time to go back to what it is to be human. And so there is that desire for these quick fixes to try and find a solution to a problem which is probably much deeper, and everyone's got their own problem. That's what I'm trying to say. And it's like, until you really take time to reflect on what that is, yes, you can use the quick fixes to deal with superficial issues, but they won't necessarily give you the depth of the spirituality that you're looking for. Because certainly from my experience, I know very few people who meditate on a daily basis, regardless of what their religious affiliation is. But the few people that I do know, some of them do it just so that they can get through the day. And I don't think that that's a solution either.
No, and I'm just thinking about, I'm up here in Scotland, and I'm thinking about this whole thing about technology and quick fix and getting through the day and having the time to reflect. And I thought, I'm so glad that I live in 2018 and not in 1718 or 1818 in Scotland, because so much of my time certainly would have likely been taken up just surviving by planting stuff around the croft and trying to maintain the bare minimum of daily life, because life was so harsh and for the vast majority of people. But yet spirituality would have been intertwined with that harshness of life. And I'm very grateful for the technology that gives me a much easier life.
Mm.
But yet at the same time, that technological mind frame that infiltrates spirituality is, I've lost something that maybe I'm looking back on my ancestors with rose-tinted glasses, I don't know, but there's something, their connection with each other, their connection with nature seemed to be a lot stronger. But if you're having to live from hand to mouth in subsistence farming in Scotland in the 18th century, I don't want to be doing that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's like a conscious choice that we think that we can make. But today, if you decided, or if one decided to give up everything and go and live on a croft, you could do it. And actually, you'd probably be seen as being quite middle class in making that decision. But life would be very different and perhaps much more challenging, but you could do it. And I'm reading some really interesting books. I mean, one of the books that I think is kind of like transformational is Lost Connections by Johann Hari. And I was very reluctant to read it, but I just kept seeing message after message. And so I thought, let me just pick it up from the library. And within the first 3 pages, I thought, this is a book that I think everybody should read. And part of the reason for that is because he talks about, it's to do with issue, why there's all of a sudden a surge in anxiety and depression, and where do these things come from? And the impression I'm getting is that there are clearly a number of different sources. But one of the sources that we're faced today is loneliness. And loneliness has never really been thought of something as a cause of anxiety or depression. But also, it raises interesting questions in terms of, you can be sitting in a coffee shop working surrounded by 50 other people. Are you still lonely? Well, of course. And I think the answer for me to that question can come within the discussions around, are you spiritual? Do you have a religion? How are you connecting with your creator and with other people, etc.? But sometimes even that isn't the answer. So if you do take yourself off to that croft or the farm or whatever it is that you decide to do, will that give one the thing that they're yearning for? It may and it may not.
Yeah, there's an amazing painting in, I think it's in the National Gallery in Scotland, of a quayside in the early 19th century. And it's a family of elderly people. There's an old man in a kilt, he's sitting on a horse, and there's other elderly members of the family are gathered around him on this little quayside. And in the distance, on the horizon, you can see a small boat, and it's sailing away. And this was all about the Highland clearances, and it was about the elderly people having to remain in Scotland because they couldn't cope with the journey to the new world. And that was them saying goodbye to their next generations, their children, their grandchildren, and the loneliness and the just desolation on those faces. And I think there's something about loneliness has been there all through history. And maybe, yeah, it's a spiritual issue in the sense that how someone handles it is going to be a spiritual, it's not solution, but method of coping. Whether they turn to faith, whether they turn to companionship, whether they lose themselves in nature or work or whatever, that long tradition that we've had of loneliness seems, spirituality and religion are very much maybe tied up with that.
And I'm wondering if modern day spirituality is being used as a tool or tools or package to somehow respond to that increasing loneliness that people are feeling, because no one's really talking about it. And that's the thing that I find so fascinating, because to some degree everyone experiences loneliness, and yet it's something that's nowhere in the media. It's something that just seems to be a massive elephant, not just in the room, but in the world. And I think that when we start speaking about this, maybe that maybe there could be a reduction in things like, suicide numbers and, addictions to substances and to crime and to other things. Because the minute that you start having a conversation with somebody and you form a connection, then that kind of loneliness, alienation, whatever it is that's going on inside your head, it reduces. And sometimes that can happen through a conversation with God. But those conversations are helpful. But at the end of the day, we're on earth so we can have human connection. And if we don't have those human conversations, then I think it's taking that discussion that we might have with God and just kind of like putting it somewhere where it's just completely unattainable and it's not that real. And perhaps that's the reason why when we worship in congregation, because that communal aspect of things is quite important.
Yeah, I think the communal dimension, and just when you see people walking around the street now with their heads buried in their mobile phone, it's easy to sniff and sneer at that. But actually, for many people, perhaps it's a way of dealing with loneliness. If you're a traveler, if you're a student who's on the other side of the world, you want to be connected to those that you know. You want to be connected with friends, with casual acquaintances, and it's not some sort of way of avoiding loneliness, but it's actually just being human. Yeah. But then the other side of that is, I was just at the fireworks at the end of the Edinburgh Festival on Monday night, and the number of people for at least the first piece when the fireworks were going, they were watching it through the mobile phone.
Yeah.
And there was a guy just in front of our group who spent most of the evening watching the fireworks through his iPad. And I thought, why did you even bother paying 16 quid to come here? You'll get far better video online afterwards. But so I suppose what I'm saying is the mixed benefits of the technology and spirituality and loneliness, it's never straightforward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting, what you've highlighted about how we experience things through technology. And I wonder if the experience of religion is becoming a more connected experience because of technology. Because now if you have a question, you can just, go online and find the answer within an instant. But then the downside of that actually is that you don't spend that time mulling it over in your mind and thinking, well, why am I asking? Because we just live in this kind of instant gratification. And spirituality is not going to serve that. And I think I suspect religion is not going to take too kindly to it either. So we have some interesting things to unpack there. But then I'm grateful for technology, because if it wasn't for technology, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation. And I think that certainly I'm sitting in a room by myself at home, and one might think that that's quite a lonely experience. But it's not, because as soon as I open my laptop and I invite you into my home, we have a connection and a conversation, and that can sometimes be the most powerful thing that happens all day.
And I think the instant gratification is one of the main maybe problems. Because if we're looking for technology to give us an instant gratification or religion, then we're trying to short circuit something that seems to be part of what it means to be human, that doesn't get instant gratification. It's not an instant, immediate solution. It's something that's hard worked at. I would love the idea that I could shove a loudspeaker under my pillow at night that's someone speaking some great highly technical book, and then I would listen to it during the night while I'm asleep, and I'd wake up and I'd understand it all in the morning. It'd be fantastic. But at least for the next probably 50, 100 years, that's not going to be the case. And probably a good thing. Because getting to learn and understand something through really wrestling with it, that's the point.
Absolutely. And for me, that's where spirituality and religion are, I think. And I mean, one of the things that prompted me for wanting to have this conversation is that within positive psychology, there are very clear, distinct definitions for spirituality and religion. And I kind of sit on the fence because I think it's easy to have clear distinctions, but sometimes it's to do with how the individual actually even interprets those words. And so coming back to what you've said, for me, it's all about how we continue these conversations and continue to kind of expand our understanding of what it is why we are on this planet and how we can improve our experience of life as religious people. And to me, that's everything that practical theology is about.
Yeah, and I wonder if institutions like church, like mosque, like synagogue or whatever, are actually providing us with frameworks that slow us down, that remind us that we can't get instant gratification, that spirituality is not a technology, and that religion is a way of saying, actually, hang on, you need to work at this. This is not an instant fix. There's not a technological, in that broad sense of the word, solution. That we have to wrestle with these things. We have to be connected. And maybe that's where, in my sort of framework of religion and spirituality, that's where religion sort of fits in. It's a reminder, it's a framework, it's a traditioning, making that tradition contemporary of, here's people who have wrestled with these things in different ways. What can we learn from them? And so it's about history. And history within practical theology. It's not something that we've tended to do a lot of. But maybe there's a place to get more of a historical take on something when we think practical theology about how society is affecting us and we're affecting society. And just that putting a brake on what we expect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few PhDs that could come out of just what you've just said there. But I think with that, it's a good time for us to draw this conversation to a close, because there is just so much that we could unpack. And I think there are a couple of subjects that I certainly would love to come back to in the future. Certainly loneliness, and then also just something around quick fixes, because I think there's some interesting conversations to be had there. Eric, thank you so much for such an engaging discussion again, and to the audience, thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, or if you'd like to go back to watch any of the previous episodes, or would like to connect with us, all of our details are below, and we hope to see you in another conversation very, very soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.